After the War of 1812, things got a little quieter in America, maybe too quiet for some. So we talked about how after the War of 1812, the Federalists basically disappear as a kind of national political force, and the Democratic Republicans for a little while are the only game in town. So they're basically the sort of establishment party. And they'd already kind of been moving in the direction of being more moderate, less radical, less ideologically pure than they had been during their first uh, arrival on the political scene under Jefferson. You remember that the Democratic Republican Party is all about opposing government activism, trying to limit the government, especially opposing acts of the government that might be seen as favors to the wealthy mercantile elite of the Northeast. But James Madison, Jefferson's successor, did a few things that actually seemed to play right into the hands of the kinds of things the Federalists had wanted. He chartered another Bank of the United States. He supported a new tariff. He supported government sponsored infrastructure projects. Another important bit of context is that both Madison and Monroe were from Virginia. And Virginia is the oldest settlement in the country. It's not the first to become a state, but it's in a sense the oldest state in the country, just as Jefferson had been. But the country was growing. Especially after the War of 1812. It was growing. You have accelerating expansion, settlers pouring into that Louisiana Purchase territory, pouring into that Northwest territory, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and 6 new states are born in the decade after 1812. States like Tennessee, Mississippi, Missouri, states to the west. Maine also comes in, but that's another story, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But the country is growing, and yet the political establishment still seems like it's sort of stuck in the past of the country. It's these sort of Virginia aristocrats, and while their party once was kind of the radical party that took up the cause of the people, it seemed to have kind of moderated, kind of lost some of that radical spark. And so some people were kind of disenchanted with the party at a time when an exciting, unconventional politician arose on the national scene. And this was General Andrew Jackson, who we talked about was a hero of the War of 1812. He had fought the Creek in the Southeast. He had also fought at the famous Battle of New Orleans. And he ran for the Democratic Republican nomination in the 1824 election. Now, Andrew Jackson was a wealthy guy. He was the owner of a large slave plantation in Tennessee called the Hermitage. But by the standards of the day, he was still thought of as something of an outsider. He was from Tennessee, a young state. He belonged to the frontier region of the country, an area seen as sort of less civilized, less thoroughly governed than the older parts of the country like Virginia. And it was an area where those who were priced out of opportunity in the East went to chase the American dream, went to acquire property, maybe to acquire enough property to be able to vote and participate in politics. So Jackson is what we might call sort of nouveau riche, new money rather than old money, not sort of high class or aristocratic in the same way that the presidents of the US had been before then. And he was known to have killed a man in a duel in 1806. And there were lots of rumors about his wild and dangerous character. He was seen as a figure of the wild American frontier and someone who definitely represented the new face of the nation, the part of the nation that was growing and changing and dynamic. And his main rival for the nomination was someone who perfectly symbolized the way that the Democratic Republican Party seemed to have lost that crusading kind of anti-government energy. And this was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a former Federalist. He was from the Federalist stronghold of Massachusetts, and he was the son of the former President John Adams, leading Federalist. So if that guy is, a candidate for the nomination of the Democratic Republican Party, it's a sign that the Democratic Republican Party isn't quite what it used to be. And John Quincy Adams actually won the nomination over Jackson, and many people were upset by that. A lot of people thought there was something kind of fishy about that. They called it the corrupt bargain, because none of the candidates for the nomination won a majority, and so the election had to be decided by the House of Representatives. The House decided in favor of Adams, and perhaps not coincidentally, the person who was the Speaker of the House, a man named Henry Clay, was offered the job of Adams's Secretary of State. So this was seen as maybe he cut a deal to get this plum position in Adams' administration, sort of chose him undemocratically as president in order to get that deal. Jackson supporters call this the corrupt bargain, and they end up rallying behind a new political party that Jackson is going to form, a schism, a party that's going to break away from the Democratic Republican Party and just be called the Democratic Party. So another detail that you should understand if you want to understand the context around why people are so enthusiastic about Jackson is that voting rights were expanding in this time in some ways and contracting in others. Basically, most states outside of a core of slaveholding states in the South were eliminating property qualifications for voting. We're bringing about what we would call universal white manhood suffrage, meaning that all white men, not just the rich, could vote. Interestingly, at the same time as you see that expansion, you see a contraction in other ways. A lot of state constitutions that are expanding the right for white men to vote are also going to write in new restrictions on the rights of Black people to vote, or in the case of New Jersey, which had allowed women to vote, restrictions on that as well. In some cases, it's an outright ban. In other cases, it's that their qualification is going to have to be higher than the qualification white people have to meet. It's interesting to think about why this was. Perhaps it was just because eliminating property qualifications would have led to more Black voters than the average white American felt comfortable with at the time. It could be that there was still in the political culture of the United States an idea that the right to vote wasn't something universal, but was an exclusive property, that there had to be somebody left out in order for it to mean something, so that if it was going to expand in one way, it had to contract in another. But either way, the expansion of white manhood suffrage goes along with a retraction of the kinds of openings for Black political participation that had existed in a bunch of states in the post-revolutionary era, as we talked about earlier. But with all these new white men coming to vote, these are going to be the people who maybe would have supported someone like Jefferson but couldn't actually vote. But these people are really going to be looking for someone who they feel like represents them, someone who represents the up-and-coming American, not the established American, who represents the masses, the people. And Jackson, as something of an outsider in the standards of the day, seemed to represent that. When Jackson won the 1828 presidential election, there was this massive public rally in Washington that almost kind of turned into a riot. And it was very unlike what politics had looked like previously. That kind of huge public demonstration was not so much a part of American politics. There tended to still be a slightly aristocratic culture, an idea that there was something a little ungentlemanly about campaigning too hard, about fraternizing with crowds too hard. So this big crowd of Jackson supporters, which Jackson even permitted to enter the White House, where legend has it they caused a lot of destruction, was seen to represent this real shift in the way that politicians related to the public and the way the public related to its politicians. There's this famous letter by a woman who was a resident of Washington, D.C., Margaret Smith. I'll read a little bit of it describing the events on the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. The south side of the Capitol was literally alive with the multitude who stood ready to receive the hero and the multitude who attended him. When the speech was over, the president made his parting bow. The barrier that had separated the people from him was broken down, and they rushed up the steps, all eager to shake hands with him. It was with difficulty that he made his way through the Capitol and down the hill to the gateway that opens on the avenue. Here for a moment he was stopped. The living mass was impenetrable. And while a passage was opened and he mounted a horse which had been provided for his return, for he had walked to the Capitol, Then such a cortege has followed him: countrymen, farmers, gentlemen, mounted and dismounted, boys, women and children, black and white, carriages, wagons, and carts, all pursuing him to the president's house. We set off to the president's house, but on a nearer approach found an entrance impossible. The yard and avenue was compact with living matter. But what a scene did we witness! The majesty of the people had disappeared, and a rabble, a mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. What a pity! What a pity! No arrangements had been made, no police officers placed on duty, and the whole house had been inundated by the rabble mob. We came too late. So that's obviously someone who was a little uncomfortable with this style of politics, but it represents the mob, the rabble, the masses, the great diversity of people who didn't have horses, black, white, people from the lower ends of society, having the opportunity to see the president, feeling a connection with the president, feeling like he represented them. So Jackson's legacy as president, he served 2 terms, is defined mostly by 2 great acts. One we call the Bank War and one we call Indian removal. And both of these acts could be seen as an expression of Jackson's devotion to the interests of the up-and-coming Americans over the interests of the established elite, the way that he favored those Americans who were on the make, who were hoping to get something out of the expansion of the country. So the Second Bank of the United States, which had been chartered by Madison, was a private bank located in Philadelphia, but it had the exclusive right from the government to basically be the storer of government funds and to control the U.S. money supply by being the bank that kind of lent money to other banks. Not that different from the Federal Reserve. It is different from the Federal Reserve overall in some important ways, but we don't need to get into the weeds of that. Basically, this is the government bank, but it's a for-profit private bank, and it has this control over the U.S. currency supply. So it's this Northeastern corporation with this special monopoly from the government. Obviously, that in the sort of Jeffersonian tradition raises some red flags. It seems like an opportunity for corruption. It seems like government favoritism, and it's not explicitly provided for in the Constitution. Also, it didn't always seem to work that well for the people. In 1819, there was this depression that was caused by a big sort of debt-fueled speculation in Western lands, and that especially hit people in these newer parts of the country in the West when that bubble burst. You can think of it as something like the 2008 financial crisis, where there's a lot of kind of reckless lending of money for investments that aren't that sound. The investments all collapse, and people look at the banks that lent the money and say, what were you doing? And at the top of that pyramid is this Bank of the United States. And so that turns a lot of people against that Bank of the United States, especially in the Western frontier areas. They start using this term, the money power, to refer to this sort of unaccountable financial elite that plays with American currency in a way that hurts average Americans. So Jackson kills the bank in 1832 by vetoing the renewal of the bank. And he gives this veto message that really captures a lot of that kind of populist energy. He says, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." So it was an injustice that, the stockholders of this bank had this special privilege from the government. Now, the veto of the bank actually probably wasn't all that good for the economy. It led to a more chaotic financial situation with these different little banks springing up, much less control over the currency supply. Jackson has to try to correct that by removing currency from circulation, or basically preventing paper currency from being used for certain purposes. I won't get into the details of that. I'll just suffice to say that the veto of the bank was a powerful symbolic action. Whether it was actually the best thing for Jackson's constituency is something that can be debated. The Indian Removal Act is now remembered by almost everyone as a very shameful episode in America's past, but it should also be understood as something that responded to the needs and desires of the up-and-coming Americans, those who didn't have much, maybe, but were looking for opportunity as the country expanded. Settlers had been steadily pouring into the western parts of the Southeast, settlers who didn't find opportunity to, start their own plantation in Virginia, where the market was kind of saturated. They moved west. They moved to places like western parts of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But these territories were also home to the Cherokee Indians. And the Cherokee Indians were one of the quote-unquote civilized tribes. They had substantially assimilated into American life. Many of them had acquired farms. They had acquired slaves. Some of them had acquired substantial wealth. They dressed often in an American fashion. They were Christians. And the leader of the Cherokee was this man named John Ross, someone who today would probably be seen as white by most people. He had only 1/8 Native ancestry. But he attempted to secure government enforcement of the Cherokee rights over their own territory, which was being progressively invaded by settlers and squattlers who were moving in, who were being aggressive, who were trying to push Cherokee off of their land. But Andrew Jackson would ultimately do the opposite of protecting the Cherokee. He would oversee a treaty that was made with probably an unrepresentative faction of the Cherokee in 1836, who were willing to accept relocation of the Cherokee west of the Mississippi River to Oklahoma to make way for settlers. It was called the Treaty of New Echota, in return for a pretty inadequate financial compensation. In 1838, in defiance of a Supreme Court ruling against the enforcement of this treaty, Jackson sent the military to escort over 15,000 Cherokee and over 1,000 of their slaves from their land in the Southeast to a new reservation in Oklahoma. That march is today known as the Trail of Tears. More than 3,000 are estimated to have died on the journey. This was a very consequential act of Andrew Jackson's, because it opened up this territory of land to white settlement that would end up being very, very valuable for the production of a crop that was going to change America in a big way. And that crop was cotton. But we're going to talk more about that soon.